Hello and welcome back. In this week's video we're going to take a look at HDR processing. It's not something that I use an awful lot, but there are times when you have extreme exposure situations that you need to make multiple exposures and blend them together. Now you might think that processing in Lightroom or Photoshop will give you more or less the same result, but they don't. So let's have a look and see what happens when you try to process using Lightroom or Photoshop or even some third-party software. So let's get started. So before we go and have a look at how we do the processing in both Lightroom and Photoshop, let's have a look at the final results. And I've got these side by side here. On the left is the version produced using Photoshop's HDR Pro blending, and on the right is my version created using Lightroom. And you'll see that there are differences. As much as I've tried to keep the processing the same, there are subtle differences, and looking at either one on their own, you'd be happy with the result. But things are a little bit different once we zoom in to look at the overall sharpness of the image, and that's one thing that's really critical in HDR. And if I zoom this image into 100%, you can see here that there's quite a lot of good sharpness both in the foreground and the tree in the distance, and it looks pretty good. But if we look at the version created in Lightroom, again zooming to 100%, things are a little different. Apart from the different colouring in the horizon, you can see that there's nowhere near as much sharpness in the foreground areas, even though in these finished versions I've applied the same sorts of processing to each of the base images. So now let's go back and look at how we process each of these versions and see where the differences arise. So let's now have a look at how we process these in Lightroom initially. And just looking at the three versions I had in Lightroom of the lone tree, I have three different exposures. Each of these has been processed slightly, but the same things like lens corrections have been applied, but no sharpening. And what we do to create our HDR using Lightroom, we select all three of our base images by shift clicking, right mouse click, and we just go to Photo Merge HDR, and it will open a new menu box and it will create a preview for you. And you'll see here that on the top right you've got the auto align and auto settings box ticked, and this should help you get the images aligned. These were taken on a tripod, so there should have been no movement, but just in case, we'll allow that to create its own alignment and then give us a preview of the merge. And it does take a little bit of time to generate this, so let's just quickly skip through to the preview once it's created. So now Lightroom has produced a preview and it's blended the three images together, and the overall preview looks pretty flat, but this is going to save as a digital negative file, and that will allow us to then process the file. So once we have checked our options here, I don't believe there's anything much in the way of ghosting, so I've left that at low. I've created the stack, and I'm going to click on merge, and it will create an HDR that we can then read as a DNG file and do some processing to it. And I'm going to cancel that because I've already done that. And here is my DNG file that's been created using that technique. And then you'll see that we can then move ahead and do some processing in Lightroom to create the effect we want. And you can adjust whatever you want to get the overall look, bearing in mind that we're trying to achieve an overall exposure that's quite acceptable. We've got a little bit of blocked up blacks, so we'll just move those back out, and then we would open that in Photoshop and complete our processing. And at this stage the image should look reasonably good. I'm going to leave any sharpening and other processing until I get it into Photoshop. So let's now move into Photoshop and have a look at how we processed it. So here we have the base image opened in Photoshop. So I've opened the DNG file from Lightroom without any further adjustments. I did do some adjustments in the previous section, but I've opened the image without any further adjustments into Photoshop. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to apply the Topaz denoise and sharpen filters to it, just to give it a bit more sharpness. Now you probably won't see this looking at full size on screen, but if we zoom into 100%, and look at the detail of the tree, you can see here that in the rocks in the foreground and certainly on the tree itself, there's a lot more sharpness being brought back into the image. And the next thing I did was I applied a Nik filter using the Silver Efex Pro, high structure harsh, but blending that to luminosity. It brings out a lot of the fine structure in the image and also adds a bit of localized contrast. I find that that works really well in the images. But on top of that, we can still see that even though in our HDR version this bright sunlight area on the horizon wasn't overexposed, it still looks a little bit bright. So I've recovered the highlights a bit using a curves layer, blended to multiply, and selecting out just the brightest highlights. And how we do that is, let's go back one step. We'll go to select color range, and instead of sampled colors, we'll select highlights. And then what we just need to do is to use our range slider until we just get those really bright sections just on the horizon, something like that. Load that as a selection. You'll see there that it's picked out those really bright areas on the horizon, and then we use that as a mask to blend. I'll just deselect that. So having completed that, I've just darkened down that area, and you'll see that with a luminosity selection that's often a very precise selection, and I've used the feathering slider here to give it a little bit of added softness. That's the selection as made, and we added a little bit of softness to it. So by alt clicking on the mask takes us back to the image. So now we're getting something that's looking a little better, and further to that I've applied another Nik filter, the tonal contrast, and also a little bit of pro contrast to add a little bit of color depth to the image and a little bit of contrast. And you'll see that I've still left those dust spots behind, and this is where I patched them out using a separate layer and using the clone or the patch tool to just remove those. And then finally I just increased the red saturation a little bit to bring up this warm color in the rocks in the foreground and in the clouds, just to add a little bit more strength to it. And then finally added a little bit of a curves adjustment to the part of the sky that was the brightest part using a graduated mask. And then finally a little bit of a hue saturation adjustment just to bring up, I think I brought up the yellows a little bit to give more of a sunset feel. It may be a question then of personal taste whether you think that that's a little bit overdone. And then finally a little bit of a slight curves adjustment just to raise those darker areas slightly, and then finally darken the sky again slightly, just playing around to get it to look exactly the way I wanted. And the big difference though is if we zoom back into 100%, I think that in this version compared to what we'll have a look at now in Photoshop, is the sharpness is just not there in this foreground area. Even though this was focused and tripod held, there should be perfect sharpness. It's just losing a little bit in the image as processed in Lightroom. So let's now have a look at how we do it in Photoshop. So now looking at how we do the same processing in Photoshop, we go back to our original source files. We have our 3 exposures that were made in situ, and instead of blending them in Lightroom, we go to Edit In and we do Blend to or Merge to HDR Pro in Photoshop. So let's do that and see what happens. It will open the 3 files in Photoshop, and it will take just a little while to load each of these 3 files. These are all 45 megapixel images, so there's a little bit of work in blending these together and loading them. So you'll see that Photoshop loads the images as a stack, and then we'll open up a separate window to merge it to HDR. So here we have the image preview open in Merge to HDR Pro in Photoshop, and we've got the 3 images loaded, and we have a couple of options. Firstly, you'll see that there's a couple of different options on the mode, and if we select 16-bit, you only get to do your toning here, and if you also went to 8-bit, which we wouldn't do, but you have the same option. But going to 32-bit, we have the option of toning in Camera Raw, which is what we want to do. And the first thing we'll want to do, though, before we go there, is to have a look at the sky. And you'll see here that there's a little bit of a strange effect, and that's because there's a bit of ghosting because the clouds move between the exposures. So by ticking the box that says remove ghosts, it's now taking that part of the sky image from the middle exposure, and now we can go and complete our toning in Camera Raw. So let's tick the box that says tone in Camera Raw, and it will complete the blend. And then open it in Camera Raw. Now, here is my file blended together. You'll see that it looks pretty dark, and now we can get into Camera Raw and do some blending and toning. And you'll see initially that there's a lot of overexposure here, so I don't quite know why that it comes up with that effect in Camera Raw, but let's say we've taken all of those tones down and we've pushed our shadows all the way up and given the exposure a little bit of a tweak. You'll see now that it's bringing out some overexposure in our highlights and whites, so I'm going to pull those down back again and try and juggle these tones till we get an acceptable exposure. I'll turn that highlight clipping off, and here we would want to add some texture and clarity and probably even a little bit of extra vibrance, and then we can move into doing the finishing processing in Photoshop. So let's click OK and move on into Photoshop with that applied. So here we have the process file open in Photoshop, and now we're going to apply the same sort of settings that we used on the Lightroom version. And just to demonstrate how I would use the topaz filters, I'll just make a duplicate of the background layer. You don't really need to do this, but for the purposes of illustration, I've created a duplicate layer, and if you have Topaz installed, it will be available from your filters menu. And let's have a look at Topaz Denoise and see what it can do for us. And again, I use the same filters on the version that I did with Lightroom. So let's just move the filter box over onto our screen, and what I have here is I have an option to compare different versions of the denoise filter, and what I want to see is I want to see how the effect is applied around this tree, because that's the focus of the image really. And you'll see that there's, in the comparison view, we've got the standard model, the clear model, the low light model, and the severe noise model. Now I think the clear version creates too many halos, so I'm not going to use that. The standard one doesn't seem to bring out enough detail in the tree. I can see more detail in the tree. And the severe noise, I don't think it does as good a job as low light. So if I click on the low light version and then click on my split view, it will regenerate that preview and show me a larger version of the image, just to make sure that I'm happy with what it's doing. And on the left is the image without the filter applied, and on the right is with the filter applied. And you'll see now that it's bringing back an appreciable amount of sharpness. Even though this is just the denoise, I'm really not doing much with the sharpness. In fact, I'm going to take the sharpness all the way out. I'm just going to take away any vestiges of noise in the image. And even though it was shot at low ISO, it was a longish exposure, and so there's a chance that some noise will creep in. So with that selected, I click on apply, and it will process the image, and depending on the speed of your processor, it will take a lot of time or a little bit of time, and then it will apply it to your image. So now I can just call this denoise, just abbreviate that to denoise, and then to apply the sharpness separately, I could do it on a separate layer, but I've already applied the denoise. I'm going to apply the filter over the top of denoise, so I'll just go back into my filters menu, Topaz Sharpen AI, and we'll bring up the menu for that and have a look at the options with that. And again, it opens up in a separate window, and we can just bring this over and apply it here. We also have a comparison view where I can look at a number of the different models and see which one works the best for me. Just move that around until I can get a fairly good view. And there's a whole lot of different options here. Some of them don't look remarkably different, but you need to allow them each to generate the preview before you can make an assessment of it. And you'll see here that we've still got this little bit of an issue that we will fix up later on. But what I'm really looking to see is how much sharpness it's going to add to the image. Now, there's a whole bunch of different ones that we can select. I've got out of focus normal here. I've got motion blur here. There was no motion in the camera because it was on a tripod, so that's not really going to help us. Out of focus, very blurry. Looks as though it might just add a little bit too much in the way of halos around the image, and doesn't look much different from out of focus. And the too soft normal, well, it doesn't seem to do much at all. So if I wanted to change that, let's say I wanted to use the too soft, very blurry option, I could click on that. But you'll see here that it's starting to add some rather nasty halos. I don't really want that. So I think I will just stick with the out of focus normal. Again, go to my split view, allow it to generate a new preview showing the larger version, because what I don't want is I don't want to add any nasty artifacts into the image after doing all this work to blend it together. And by moving our split screen backwards and forwards, you can see that there's quite a lot more sharpness brought out in the image using this filter, and very, very slight halos, but quite acceptable given that we're looking at this at 100%. So with that one selected, I can then choose whether I want to use my automatic settings and it will regenerate that, or I can even let it automatically choose which model it thinks is best. Now it says out of focus normal, which is what I had chosen anyway, so that's all fine. And then let's apply that. And certainly the Sharpen AI processing can take a lot longer than the denoise filter, again dependent on the processing speed of your computer. In this case it's going to go through fairly quickly, and it will tell you that it's going to finish soon, which is really helpful. And once that's done, we'll now be able to compare the before and after versions because it's on a separate layer. So here we go. Let's just zoom in. And it's always important to look at things at 100% or 50% on your screen. If you're viewing things at an odd percentage of magnification, you're not getting a pixel for pixel rendition of the image on your screen. So let's just have a look now. And with the sharpening and denoise turned off, you can see that there's quite a bit of softness, even though this was correctly focused. And then turning that back on, it's really brought that back into sharp relief. So it's well worthwhile using these filters to improve the quality of your image. So having applied that sharpening and denoise, we can get on with doing the other things to our image. And so let's have a look. First thing I did here was I applied a curve to lighten this bottom part of the image, because even the Photoshop version didn't seem to give me the tonal range that I wanted and that I was able to get from Lightroom, even though it gave us a sharper result. So I've applied a curves layer and applied it to the bottom of the image, just brushed that on. I've applied another curves layer where I just added a little bit of contrast, very subtle amount of contrast. And then again I've applied my Silver Efex Pro filter to bring out the fine detail, the tonal contrast and pro contrast filters in Nik, again bringing up that drama in the image. And then I've had to do two separate lots of patching here where I had that funny little artifact in the water. I'm not quite sure why the HDR Pro brought that in, but I had to then do a little bit of cloning, just selectively cloning in on a separate layer. Just got rid of that. It wasn't too much of an issue, and so that was gone. And then of course we've got the dreaded sensor dust, and it seems that in this image a whole lot more sensor dust was visible once we brought it in. You can see here quite a lot of nasty sensor dust. We're able to get rid of that, and then we're looking pretty good. Again, added another curves adjustment just to lighten the top of the image, and you'll see here that I'm still concerned about those highlights in that bright area. I've used that recover highlights option. Again, blurred it quite considerably using the feathering option, and it's just brought back the detail in that highlight area. Again, played around a little more with curves just to get it exactly the way I wanted it. Let's go back to the fit screen version. Just tweaking the curves a little bit, decided that it was a little bit dark, added a little bit more colour, and in this instance I added a colour blend layer just to add a little bit more colour into that sky, and then finally a final curves adjustment. The important thing is, because they're processed in two different lots of software, the results are going to be a little bit different. But if we zoom into that 100% view and look at the sharpness of the final image, I think you'll see that the Photoshop version definitely gave us a sharper result. Again, viewing it at 100%, it definitely has more detail over the Lightroom version. So what about other methods of processing to HDR? Without resorting to some of the expensive third-party pieces of software which cost as much as an annual subscription to Photoshop, I'm just going to use the Nik versions and a couple of other options in Photoshop. So let's do a little bit of a comparison in Photoshop. I've got them all open. Let's go and have a look. The first option is I can do a single image process to HDR using the Nik software, which is fairly straightforward. You open it in Photoshop and take it into Nik and use the blending to make it a single image. Now, it's not too bad. It's not great. It's a little bit lacking in contrast and detail, but it's not too bad. Second one was to use 3 images in the Nik HDR blending, but to do that you have to firstly export them from Lightroom into TIFF format, and then re-import them into Photoshop, take it into Nik, and so forth and so on. And it's given me some rather odd effects, particularly this sort of dark area around the tree, and generally not as good. So that's another option that we have available to us. And there's another option that I used, which was to take the same raw file and process it 2 different ways, one for the highlights, one for the shadows, and then blend it into an HDR in Lightroom, and then do the same processing in Photoshop. And it doesn't look as good either. It's lacking a little bit of that extra detail, and so it's not great. And then of course we have our 2 versions that we've already looked at. So let's now have a look at these and compare them, and we'll tile these all vertically to have a look at the differences. Now let's see what we can do with each of these. And no, they're not going to zoom back for us so that we can do a comparison. But you can see, looking at these, there are differences between each version, and some are better and some are not so good. But if you looked at each of these individually, you might be happy with the results. But to cut it down, let's just look at these options again. The Nik single HDR we decided wasn't as good as the other versions. Let's go back and consolidate these all back to tabs. The single HDR version, not so good. We can eliminate that from the choices. And then let's have a look now. The 3 images converted to HDR using Nik and all of the extra work didn't reveal a result that was worthwhile, so we can eliminate that as well. The dual processed version wasn't too bad, but we've got 3 images to work with. Why wouldn't you go back and use the 3 of them, so we can eliminate that. So now we're left with these 2, and let's do a straight comparison side by side. You'll see that there are differences, but overall the Photoshop version gives a better result, even though the processing in Lightroom was a lot simpler. Overall, when it comes to looking at the sharpness and the detail in the image, Photoshop version makes a worthwhile difference. So let's just zoom in and do a bit of a comparison again, as we did at the outset. At 50%, you can clearly see that there is more detail in the Photoshop version. Now maybe a little bit more practice and working with the Lightroom parameters might help, but overall I think the Photoshop version gives the better result. So I hope that's been helpful. I look forward to seeing you again soon.